Literacy is not a matter of luck, postcode or chance. It's a matter of equity, access and social justice. In this episode of Magnify Matters, distinguished Professor Pamela Snow, one of Australia's leading voices in literacy, language and the science of learning, joins host Tim Edwards for a conversation about what it takes to ensure every child learns to read well. Pam reflects on the personal, professional and research journey that has shaped her national leadership in literacy, from speech pathology and brain injury rehabilitation to her advocacy for evidence-informed reading instruction and the establishment of La Trobe University's Solar Lab. In this episode, Tim and Pam explore why learning to read is a social justice issue, not an individual outcome, what cognitive science tells us about how children learn to read and why the debate went on for so long, why the first 3 years of school matter more than any later intervention, how strong Tier 1 instruction supports both learning and well-being, the role of speech pathologists and interdisciplinary collaboration in schools, and why lifting teacher expertise lifts the profession itself. Whether you're teaching in the early years, leading a school, shaping system-wide improvement, or supporting learning at home, this episode offers clear principles, grounded insight, and a strong case for doing fewer things better for every learner. Now stay with us as we magnify what truly matters in education.
Today we are very lucky to have distinguished Professor Pamela Snow join us on Magnify Matters. Welcome, Dr. Pam.
Thank you very much, Tim. It's a real delight to be here.
Thanks so much again for all that you've offered to support us in Sandhurst as we have launched the journey of Magnify and Magnify Matters podcast. We're thrilled to have you on today. And again, Pam, your ongoing support, your reference, the access that we have to be able to connect with you, we are privileged, and a sincere thank you from us and all of our people.
Well, thanks, Tim. You are very welcome. As a resident of Bendigo, it's a particular privilege for me to be able to do whatever I can.
Pam, we might just get you to kick off for us in terms of your journey. We're going to go through today. We'll no doubt touch on lots of different items, but I'd like to just start with you and your education journey into your study and research and all that has followed to become very distinguished.
Wow, okay. How far back do you want to go?
Go on.
How much?
Grew up, went to school.
Okay. I grew up in Melbourne, in the southeastern suburbs in Oakley. I grew up in a family of mixed Anglo-Catholic heritage. So I've literally got one Catholic side of the family, one Anglican Presbyterian side of the family, and there's a pretty complicated story behind that. And part of that story is that my father, who was from the Anglican Presbyterian side of the family, came from a quite middle-class, relatively privileged background and attended a private school in Melbourne. My mum, from the Catholic side of the family, came from a very poor background. She grew up in the northeast in Victoria, and her mother was widowed at 37 during the Depression with 9 children. And my mother had a catastrophic accident when she was 11 that put her in hospital for 2 years in Wangaratta. When I say in hospital, on the veranda of the Wangaratta Base Hospital for 2 years, because there wasn't a children's ward. So when it snowed in Wangaratta, she was pushed in up against the wall and they put a ground sheet over her bed. It was pretty miserable. But significantly, that was the end of my mother's education. And she was a really bright woman and had 4 children whose education she really nurtured and nourished because she was an avid reader, she was an articulate woman, she was a great thinker, she was witty and resourceful, but one of her big regrets in her life was that she didn't get to finish school. And so I guess I had 2 very different narratives from my parents that both fed into me being not hothoused at all. There was never any sense of that, but I was nurtured and supported, and I was fortunate to love learning.
Thank you for that beautiful intro and for your personal sharing there. It's often interesting, isn't it, what brings us to where we get to. And I'm hearing already some passionate threads from an early year around the notion of high quality, valuable education.
Absolutely.
So beyond schooling, you went off and studied
So after secondary school, I studied speech pathology at what was the old Lincoln Institute of Health Sciences in Carlton, as it was then. It eventually got swallowed up into the Faculty of Health Sciences at La Trobe. So my connection with La Trobe goes back a long time. And I loved studying speech pathology and I loved being a speech pathologist. I felt pulled in so many different directions. I could easily have gone and worked as a child language practitioner. I could have worked in deaf education. As it happened, I ended up working in acquired brain injury. I was part of the team at what was Bethesda Hospital in Melbourne, in Richmond, run by the Salvos, part of the team that established Australia's first specialised brain injury rehab program in collaboration with what was then the Motor Accidents Board, that was the antecedent to the Transport Accidents Commission. So they were really exciting, action-packed days, being at the forefront of something really innovative and creative and responsive to very complex needs around the needs of people who were so severely injured that they couldn't access rehabilitation in mainstream rehab facilities. That's where Bethesda, that journey started. But that gave me fantastic exposure to a lot of the knowledge that I call on to this day about human information processing, learning, memory. When you're working in rehabilitation with people who've had brain injuries, it's all about learning and problems with learning and the number of repeated practices and opportunities for mastery that those, invariably young people need in order to have some chance of getting their lives on track. And I didn't ever imagine at that time, I guess, that I was going to be using that same very valuable knowledge in a very different way later on in my career. So I completed my PhD when I was working at what is now the brain injury rehab program at Epworth. And then after my PhD, and that was obviously in the area of outcome after brain injury, I wanted to diversify. I ended up taking a role with the Australian Drug Foundation and Deakin University, working in schools and sporting clubs around drug and alcohol prevention research, which just opened my eyes, broadened my perspective so much about public health thinking and public health frameworks and thinking about social determinants of health and why we have so many inequities in education and other outcomes in Australia. And then that led to an interest in vulnerable young people, specifically young people in the youth justice system, young people in out-of-home care. And I did a couple of decades of research with some significant collaborators on the language and literacy profiles of young people in the justice system and in the out-of-home care systems, who, as you know, are very often one and the same group of students. And ultimately, we also looked at young people in flexible alternative education settings. And I started off looking at their language skills because wearing my speech pathology hat, and I had along the way qualified as a psychologist as well, but wearing my speech pathology hat, I was very interested in the fact that this was a group of students with hidden language disorders because their behaviour problems were what entered the room 10 minutes before anything else did, and it's what the adults noticed about them, that they had these complicated externalising behaviour problems, which meant that sometimes we didn't look any further at what was going on and we knew that they weren't doing well academically. So that was a significant and really satisfying body of work to be involved in, to highlight that this is a group that we're overlooking, and we're overlooking their language and communication needs. And that had all kinds of implications for how those young people go through the justice system, the courts, restorative justice conferencing in schools and in the court system, counselling. But it really sparked an interest in me in literacy, because it seemed to me that there's a pretty big lever that we could be pulling in the lives of these young people, and that's giving them successful reading and writing opportunities that wasn't happening. So why weren't they getting the benefit that other students were getting when they were going to school, particularly at primary school, they were attending primary school? And why was it that by year 3 had effectively disengaged, and they were disengaging with behaviour problems and inadequate reading, writing and spelling skills? And because I was working in a public health context, that got me thinking about the huge social justice inequities that these young people were facing.
Pam, you have almost developed the perfect script for today's podcast. You have touched on so many different threads that we will explore the interconnected nature of those. But to reflect back, I just heard about someone that through circumstance was intrigued around the impact that education can have from a very, very early year of age into that work at Bethesda with that brain injury and therefore brain knowledge that you formed, the drug and alcohol work, the working with some of the very most vulnerable in our community, and to starting to draw some threads around your experience as a speech person, a psychologist, and this whole thing around language skills and academic performance. So that's a beautiful thread across many aspects of education that still, unfortunately, there are access and equity concerns. There is the right, not a privilege, to be taught to learn fundamental literacy skills properly. And we might just go down that reading wars path because obviously, and I don't want to interrupt, and we can perhaps bring out other parts of your journey along the way, including the Trobe Solar Lab work. But where does this sit in terms of your passion that, you just explained probably 20 or 30 years of your professional experience in that short summary? But where does that passion come from for access and equity around exactly that provision to high quality learning instruction?
It's a good question, Tim. I think sometimes there are advantages to being outsiders. So I don't have a background as a classroom teacher, and I'm very upfront about that. But sometimes when people are standing outside the window peering in, they see something different from what people who are inside the room can see. When you're in the water swimming in it, it looks and feels differently to those who are observing. So when I became immersed in the research on what we might call vulnerable young people, and I started thinking about these levers that we need to be pulling to change their life trajectories, but they're levers that should be pulled anyway for everybody. It shouldn't be a matter of luck and postcode and just happenstance as to who your teacher is, even within a particular school, whether you learn to read, write and spell. So, in terms of the reading wars, once I started turning over rocks, I just became more and more perplexed, I guess, as to why we're not applying knowledge that we have. Because what I was finding was significant bodies of established research, and research is always evolving, and the nature of science is that it's self-correcting. It adjusts itself over time as new evidence emerges, as it should. But it was obvious to me that there was a significant and robust body of cognitive psychology research about what the reading process is and how best to get children. I often talk about metaphorically getting children across the bridge from oral language on the near bank to reading, writing and spelling on the far bank in the first 3 years of school. And I could see that body of evidence was there, and there was, robust theoretical models like the simple view of reading that had been tested and had stood up. And yet when we look into faculties of education, they were singing from a very different song sheet, taking a much more sociological approach to reading, treating reading as a social activity, not a cognitive activity, something that we now talk about as being biologically secondary, so something that the brain doesn't just naturally pick up. But the discourse in education faculties has been, and probably in some cases still is, that reading is a natural thing for children to do. We just have to immerse them in beautiful literature experiences and they'll acquire reading in the same way that most of them, not all, but most of them have acquired oral language. I think we need to be careful not to oversimplify that message about oral language, by the way, because oral language is biologically primary, but it's not set and forget. So parents and teachers do actually invest quite a lot of time into scaffolding, support, expansions and elaborations and modelling of language, sentence structure, correct vocabulary and so forth. So yes, it's biologically primary, but it's also, as we know, quite developmentally vulnerable. So we have to have a nuanced conversation about that. But over in the faculties of education, there was this, I would say, quite fanciful view about reading and the idea that we were just going to, as Lorraine Hammond sometimes says, love children to literacy, that we'd just read them lots of beautiful books and they would just magically start reading. And then the flip side of that, unfortunately, was if they didn't, well, then there was a discourse of parent blame, or even a kind of throwing the hands up in the air and saying, oh, well, some children just aren't readers, or maybe we haven't found the right book, or, lots of excuses. So the reading was, it's maybe not nice to be using that language of war, but it really has been a fierce debate that has gone on way too long, way beyond there being enough evidence, if we apply public health thinking, for us to know what to do at scale to make things better for everybody. And that's obviously an ongoing endeavour, as you know, in Sandhurst and the Magnify project, that this is not something where you flick a switch overnight. But I think it's been a bit of a Swiss cheese scenario where there's been so many holes that what I'm going to call poor practice in faculties of education has been allowed to continue unchecked until quite recent times.
Pam, just as you explained some of that work and the work at La Trobe, and I'll get you to expand a little bit more around the development of the Solar Lab at La Trobe, but these were fundamental papers done in America and England and in Australia in 2000, early 2000s.
Even earlier.
That have sat there for some period of time. The Grattan Reading Guarantee shouldn't have been the prompt that we needed 20-odd years later and a whole generation of education later. So what sort of time frame are we talking about here in terms of your involvement and advocacy for an approach that is aligned to that research that's many years prior as well?
Look, I stand on the shoulders of giants, Tim, because people have been advocating for this change long before I came along, and it does actually go back much longer than there's the 2000 National Reading Panel report from the US. That's probably the big line in the sand. But I did my primary schooling in the 1960s, which was when Jean Chall published her landmark work in the United States and described the Year 3 slump. I think that paper was published in 1966. Now, that's the year I started school. I kind of don't mind telling you and your listeners. So, this has been a very, very long-standing embedded thing in education. And as I said, other people have been lobbying and advocating. There's been a structural problem in Australia that we still have, but we're probably showing a bit more will to overcome it. And that's the fact that we are a federation. We've got states and territories. We've got some federal input to education, but most of the decisions are made, if we're talking at government level, at the state and territory level. And then, of course, we have a significant Catholic education sector, and then we've got an independent sector. So we've got a recipe for a perfect storm when it comes to high variability. And one of my mantras is that you can't have high variability and high quality. You've got to choose one, and I think most parents and most sentient moral citizens would want high quality. So therefore, we've got to sacrifice the high variability. And that doesn't matter what our field of endeavour is, whether we're manufacturing cars or making chocolate or, in our case, teaching children how to read, write and spell. You can't have high variability and high quality.
So, Pam, the Solar Lab was developed at La Trobe in 2020.
2020, you're spot on.
Interesting time around the arrival of COVID and the impact it had, or was it an advantageous time in terms of online access and delivery through a different means?
Was both, and I'd like to give a shout out here, Tim, to a couple of key colleagues, if I may. One is Professor Joanna Barbusis, who is the Dean of the School of Education at La Trobe and now also a Pro Vice-Chancellor at La Trobe. Joanna was appointed Dean of the School of Education in late 2019 and quite promptly went about doing some very significant restructuring and created 2 new positions as a result of that restructure. My colleague and good friend, Professor Tanya Seri, was working in the speech pathology program at the Melbourne campus of La Trobe. I was here in Bendigo as head of the La Trobe Rural Health School. Tanya and I were doing more and more literacy-related work together, collaborating more and more, but from very different parts of the university and almost above and beyond our everyday kind of workloads. And long story short, we got wind of the fact that Joanna had created these 2 positions, one of which was Professor of Cognitive Psychology. You would think that a school of education might have had a Professor of Cognitive Psychology. Most still don't, and La Trobe's didn't. The other was, back then it was Associate Professor Literacy and Reading. Now, again, having the word reading in a title in a school of education is significant, because a lot of education academics would prefer to talk about literacy than reading. It's seen as a bit too granular. So Tanya and I applied for and were successful in being appointed to those positions. And one of the first things Tanya said was, we need to create a platform. So it was very much Tanya's idea and inspired idea that we had to create a virtual platform that gave us an external presence for whatever it was that we were going to do. And, there was a lot of blue sky dreaming at that point. And I had just published a paper that had used the acronym SOLAR, Science of Language and Reading. So I said to Tanya, well, how about we apply this acronym and make it ours? Tanya was happy with that. Joanna was happy with that. And then we were a month in to our new roles, and we all know what happened. COVID hit. And so we thought, well, we wanted to create some short courses anyway. And we had to talk to the university business development team who do the number crunching and look at the viability of these things. And we put a proposal to them. They said, well, you're going to need to get about 30 people for this thing to break even. Tanya and I looked at each other optimistically and thought, yeah, we think we can get 30 people. And for the first one, we had over 800, and it just went from strength to strength. The feedback was very positive, very strong. We've had 3 core short courses that we've now run more than 20 times over the last 5 years, and we've published a peer-reviewed paper reporting on feedback from nearly 1,000 of those participants. More than 12,000 teachers have done our short courses. And then we created a language and literacy stream in the La Trobe Master of Education, and we've also created a graduate certificate in language and literacy. So what this tells us is that, and I guess we knew it, but it's been really resoundingly endorsed for us, that teachers are so thirsty for useful knowledge about the reading process, about the nature of the English writing system, and how to effectively take children from novice to expert, in inverted commas, competent reader by year 3. Because teachers, if I can go out on a bit of a limb here and maybe be a bit controversial, I think teachers have been sold a bit of a crock when it comes to their initial teacher education degrees that they've paid for, that they have incurred a HECS debt for, that in relation to reading instruction have not been fit for purpose. And that came through very strongly in the feedback that we've had from teachers who've done our short courses and our masters and grad cert. Resoundingly, they say, this is what I should have learnt the first time round. I shouldn't have to do a 180-degree U-turn away from ideas, beliefs and practices that are not impactful, that work for that group of children who are going to learn regardless of what happens to them pedagogically. There are some kids who are Teflon coated and are going to get across that bridge for reasons of good genes, helpful home environments, whatever. But in what world do we want to be creating classrooms that only succeed for the ones who are already fortunate? That's just feeding into the Matthew effect, the idea that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. I want to live in a world where we lift the tail of the curve. As they say over in the US at the Reading League, a rising tide lifts all boats. And that's really what Tanya and I have wanted to be part of through our work.
And Pam, you've touched on, again, so much in that part, but a big thank you to Joanna and Tanya, who have also been involved with us in Magnify Sandhurst and conversation as we've stepped forward. It wouldn't be a podcast with Pam Snow without some sort of controversy or points raised there, so thanks for raising it. We might get to a couple of others yet. But I think that what you've shared there is probably something that we've felt in Sandhurst, with all respect to people's backgrounds or interests. People want to just do well, and how do they know what that doing well looks like in line with the current research base? And I hope you don't mind me saying, but you were part of the conversation with us around best providers, evidence-based providers, and really helped our steering committee determine what might be options for us in terms of our early years literacy instruction and reading instruction. And obviously we've gone with multi-lit, and we're very happy about the way that works playing out with the initial lit program. But again, I think it's just to echo back to you, we've had that type of feedback from our teachers. Thank you for the script that helps me do this well. Thank you for the high quality professional learning that helps me do this well. And thank you for the diagnostic evidence gathering and progressive monitoring that happens to be able to check on the spot in real time where students are and intervene as appropriate.
Which makes teachers feel like they truly are professionals and with a specialised body of knowledge and skills that other people don't have, because that's part of the criteria, I suppose, for what defines a profession.
And we've had many teachers across Sandhurst, I'm sure, would be part of those 12,000 that have been part of the Solar Lab. So congratulations on the extent of that work. Your research piece that your paper that you've released from that, what other themes come through other than, engagement from professionals in learning to have specialisation? Are there other key themes that you feel that are worth sharing today?
Well, a strong message, unfortunately, and I really do feel for teachers who express this sentiment, is one of guilt and remorse and regret about students who they think back on. Sometimes they're thinking back over decades. Students whose faces and names are still etched in their memories, who they say, I could have taught that child to read. If I knew then what I know now, I could have taught that child to read. So that has unfortunately been quite a strong theme, and that sits very uncomfortably with us, and we're very careful to never position our discourse as teacher blame. Responsibility and accountability does need to sit somewhere, and I position that squarely at the feet of universities. And when I say universities, I mean faculties of education and universities more generally, who have been complicit in allowing education programs to run in this unchecked way and to be not adopting evidence. Tanya and I haven't put new evidence in front of teachers. We've given them evidence that in many cases, as I said, has been around since the 60s. We've just got it out of the dark cupboard, dusted it off and said, here you are. And the teachers have said, oh, my goodness, this is so useful, I can use this. So it's fantastic to see that energised sense of purpose and professional identity amongst teachers, teachers who might otherwise have left the profession.
And that notion that we've used in Sandhurst to know better and therefore do better. You can't control what you can't control or has passed. And I think that's something that
Correct.
I'm really trying to work on and take your wisdom around, how we help our people develop the trust. And I'd go one further in terms of the responsibility around some of that decision-making beyond the universities to systems like ours. And there were many before us that made decisions that were unanimous across their system or their jurisdiction. Hopefully there's a bit of a shift there, but equally it's around treading carefully and supporting people that have perhaps not known better or not been asked to understand another way because their systems or jurisdictions or whatever it might be were largely inconsistent.
I think that policy inconsistency has been certainly problematic for teachers, and I think ultimately this does trickle down from the universities, but I would want to give a big shout out to the teachers on the ground who have been doing really a disproportionate amount of the heavy lifting, in many cases ahead of policy shifts. We've seen a big policy shift in Victoria in the government system, a mandate, a historic mandate about what should happen in the literacy block with 25 minutes of systematic synthetic phonics. We're seeing big shifts across Catholic dioceses, but the teachers on the ground were doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and sometimes against resistance even within their own schools. And that takes enormous courage and a strong sense of moral purpose, really, to be swimming against the tide and being able to champion better practices for their students and hopefully over time bring some of their colleagues on board.
And Pam, what sort of work do you think that the podcast Sold a Story or other research ed movements or gatherings of like-minded people, what type of impact do you think that that's given and enabled teachers to have confidence to step forward in this space?
It's hard, isn't it, to parse out what has done what. I think Emily Hanford's Sold a Story podcast has undoubtedly been a huge catalyst. Our Deputy Premier and Education Minister, that Ben Carroll, openly says he listened to it and was persuaded by the evidence that Emily presents in that podcast. And she's a fantastic storyteller, but she's done a deep dive into historical evidence and artefacts to identify how things went so wrong in reading instruction. And then around the same time, we've had the appearance of the first Research Ed conference that was auspiced by Tom Bennett in the UK, and now that's become a worldwide phenomenon. And then in Australia, sharing best practice. So both of those platforms bring teachers and researchers and allied health professionals together on a Saturday, which is a very clever manoeuvre because teachers don't have to get approvals, get CRT. I guess in some ways we preach to the choir and the choir preaches to us because it's maybe a pre-selected group. But again, I think there's enough of a momentum and a groundswell now that teachers are hearing about these sharing best practice conferences and Research Ed conferences, and then they want a piece of the action and are prepared to give up their Saturdays. And this is not one-way dialogue. This is not researchers talking at teachers. This is researchers like Tanya and me sitting in the audience listening to teachers describing what they're doing in classrooms. And that's fantastically helpful for us and informative for us. The zeitgeist has shifted a lot in the last, 5 to 10 years, but probably particularly in the last 5 years.
And there's a bottom-up and top-down movement, isn't there now?
There is
if
now.
Systems and governments
Yes.
are making decisions,
Yep.
and there's some people that hopefully are feeling well validated in their work over that last
Correct.
period of, say, 5 years. So where are we at nationally then in terms of the Australian landscape, and how long will it take to get to where we need to be?
Gosh, I wish I had a
Come
crystal
on.
ball. Well, I think we're certainly in a better position than we were pre-COVID. And, as we know, COVID had some unexpected benefits in some ways, like the amount of online learning that people were able to do in that time. The uplift in social media is always a double-edged sword, but I think more and more teachers have access to and use a variety of social media platforms, whether it's the old Twitter, now X, whether it's closed Facebook groups, Science of Reading Facebook groups. I'm seeing more and more teachers on LinkedIn, which is fantastic. So where are we now? I think we've stopped spinning the wheels in Australia, and we're seeing much more top-down pressure, if you like, accountability. The TEEP report, the Teacher Excellence Education Panel report in 2023, so that was a panel chaired by Mark Scott, Vice-Chancellor of Sydney University, former chair of the ABC. There have been so many reviews of teacher initial education in Australia, almost countless reviews. This one, I think, has really got real substance to it, meaningful recommendations, and recommendations that the Federal Education Minister, Jason Clare, has committed to. Now, I think the timeline for that commitment is ambitious because universities are expected to show compliance with those recommendations, not only around reading instruction and the science of reading, but the science of learning more generally by the start of the 2026 academic year, which we know is, only weeks away in some respects. So how much the universities that are signed off as being compliant are actually compliant, we're going to have to wait and see. But I am aware that some universities have not got through that process. So they've submitted their documentation to the QOB, it's the acronym for the committee overseeing that work, and not everyone is being signed off. So there may be some significant changes in the face of teacher initial education in Australia in the next few years as a result of this.
And Pam, I suppose that's sad to hear, but positive to hear in terms of quality assurance, isn't it? That, you can't set a standard and then not follow through with that standard. So, to hear that, I hope that our listeners find that confronting, but also appealing in some way to say, well, actually the quality of the bar has been set and improvement is expected in order to be compliant and to be able to deliver initial teacher education.
Absolutely. And we're not having these discussions about medical programs, about engineering programs, about nursing programs, psychology programs. It's initial teacher education that has stumbled in its contract with the community around applying evidence-based principles and practices in preparing graduates to be classroom ready. We know when a medical student graduates, they don't know everything that they need to know. In fact, they need to do an internship in their first year, and they're closely supervised through that internship process, and that's a pre-registration step. But we also know that there's a high level of accountability in other disciplines around the way that they prepare their graduates in the most optimal way. Nothing is fail-safe, but education has been allowed to adopt a much more laissez-faire relationship with evidence, and that's really what the recommendations of the TEEP report have shone a bright light on. And now we need to see that true compliance. I know sounds like a slightly draconian word, but we want compliance from medical programs and nursing programs. So why wouldn't we want compliance from education programs? Why would we deprofessionalise teaching by saying it's not as important as those other professions?
And right back to the beginning around access and equity, our young people deserve the very best, so quality assurance at least is certainly a requirement.
Tim, can I just say this? We wouldn't accept, if we go back to the point about 30% of students not being proficient with reading, writing and spelling, we wouldn't accept 30% of children's car seats not being safe, or 30% of children's vaccines not actually working. So why would we accept such a high, if you like, failure rate in something as core to childhood as literacy when we don't accept it in other domains of children's lives, and shouldn't either? Which
takes me to that about the time frame. And Pam, you've travelled extensively in your professional space and contributed enormously to many countries. Our Better Fairer Schools agreement that we are making some commitment to and under, how long do you think that might take to get there? I might get you to say a year, or that we will honour the targets by the year proposed. But based on what you're seeing internationally, whole of country or whole of same size population mass movement, what are you thinking and seeing?
Depends what their is, but I would like to think that in 10 years' time we're going to look back on now and say, gee, we have, once we got going, once we stopped spinning the wheels, we really got on with this. I often use a graph in presentations that shows the dramatic drop in rates of sudden infant death syndrome in Australia since 1985. I mean, that drop is just phenomenal. And that only happened because everybody got together around the evidence. So the researchers gathered the evidence, gave it to the policymakers, they gave it to the universities, they gave it to the practitioners on the ground. I would like to see that graph representing the drop in rates of reading failure in Australia in the next, well, I'd like it to be next year, but it's not going to be next year. And that was a 35-year proposition. We did see the drop start to occur quite quickly, but what happened was that everybody who got on the bus stayed on the bus, and there were no policy wobbles. The nurses and midwifery union didn't step in and say, oh, well, you're deprofessionalising nurses by telling them what they have to be saying to new mothers. There was a respect for evidence and a prioritising of evidence, and the number of babies who have now grown to adulthood as a result of that action, that combined action. I saw the figure the other day. It's something like 80,000, I think. It's a phenomenal number of lives saved. So now we have to teach all of those babies how to read. We've saved their lives, and now we've got to give them a really, really strong, robust education.
It's a great example and comparison point, and I think just put plainly like that, it's a no-brainer. Yet we know that Aero have released the report to say that students that are behind at year 3, only 20% will catch up by year 9. So 2 parts to this question, Pam, around your passion and commitment to early years, but then also perhaps take us on a bit of a journey around the role that intervention plays in your first area of training in speech pathology and where that sits as well.
I think that finding reported by ERO, and of course that ERO was drawing on existing literature when they compiled that report that gave us that very sobering statistic that if you're behind by year 3, you've got a 1 in 5 chance of catching up by year 9. And of course, what that's going to require is very intense intervention. It's not an injection, a vaccination. It's not seeing someone a couple of times a week or a couple of times a term. This requires a really purposeful, determined, coordinated effort, and clearly vast majority of children who are behind by year 3 are not the beneficiaries of that purposeful, coordinated effort. And so again, we have the Matthew effect kicking in, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. And the risk for those children is not only that they're going to need specialised literacy and often language intervention services, but they're also going to need behavioural and emotional supports. A lot of those children will develop anxiety because they feel so stressed being at school, being asked to do reading and writing based activities, which is a huge part of the curriculum, as you know. So we're going to need more and more resources, which in reality are just not there. So we have to get the first 3 years of school and beyond right, but we call foundational skills foundational because they are the foundations of everything that follows, and we can't develop more complex, elaborate skills in children who by year 3 are still struggling to get words off the page that they should be getting off the page, let alone reading fluently and for comprehension.
And to view that with a operational efficiency in mind, again, the no-brainer. You get one chance to get it right early, don't you? And then your cost in the dollar increases substantially and your likelihood of success is limited. So not to say that there's not outstanding work happening for students post-grade 3 in lots of schools everywhere, but the foundations clearly matter most.
Absolutely. That's where we're going to get the best bang for our buck. That's where it's most efficient. And when we take a public health mindset, we prevent other complications from occurring. So at all costs, we need to be preventing the development of internalising and externalising mental health problems. So we've got to be preventing the development of anxiety and depression. We've got to be preventing the development of oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, those things that I saw hugely overrepresented in the youth justice and to a lesser extent the child protection populations, certainly in the youth justice populations. These are kids who do something when they can't read, write and spell, and it's disrupt the class, and every teacher knows what that looks like and how much instructional time is lost. So it's not just those children, it's the peers around them whose time is interrupted as well.
Supporting students' learning is supporting their well-being.
Absolutely.
And we see that where schools have that culture that is learning matters most, and that will so often lead to a great, calm, safe, positive environment that is one of a positive wellbeing environment.
So important, Tim. We've got to stop talking about, and I'm gesturing here with one hand, we've got to stop talking about wellbeing on the one hand and academic achievement on the other hand, because schools that are really kicking goals, and we've got a lot of practice-based evidence around this now from schools that have changed their instructional model, we're seeing not only very strong academic data, we're seeing very strong wellbeing data, student engagement data, and huge reductions in behaviour notifications.
Pam, I brushed over it earlier around speech pathologists. We're very fortunate in Sandhurst, and maybe uniquely, we employ speech pathologists to provide regular director assessment interventions for all of our schools. So they're employed centrally and there's an aspect of consistency across all of those in Sandhurst. What does high impact speech pathology or collaboration look like between our speechies and our teachers? What's perhaps some wisdom that you can share over your knowledge and experience in both?
Really good question, Tim. One of our recent PhD completers, Caitlin Stevenson, I'll call her Dr. Stevenson. She hasn't literally walked across the stage yet, but she's finished her PhD, looked at this in her research, and I can send you the papers out of her research, which might be of interest to your listeners. I think what we need to acknowledge here is that speech pathology also needs to share the heavy lifting in developing models of best practice and ensuring that our graduates are ready to work in educational contexts, have also well-developed knowledge and understanding about the nature of the English writing system. So, for example, one of Caitlin's studies looked at the knowledge of speech pathologists with respect to the sort of linguistic constructs like morphemes, phonemes, graphemes, finding schwa vowels and so forth in words, the kind of thing that's been done testing teachers' knowledge over and over again, and there are many studies, including in Australia, showing low teacher knowledge of those constructs. Caitlin found that the speech pathologists had higher knowledge, as they should because they've studied more linguistics, but it wasn't as good as we think it should have been. So there's lots of opportunities here for the two disciplines to work together in a truly interdisciplinary way. Again, in the way that we see in health. You know, if you go into a hospital, you're not going to just be looked after by doctors. It's going to be an interdisciplinary team who is around you and applying different kinds of expertise to your care. And I'd like to see that more interdisciplinary approach occurring in schools where we tap into expertise. And I think we see different models of the use of speech pathologists at the moment, and we probably need to do more research on how effective they are. Sometimes speech pathologists are operating in what might be considered a fairly old-fashioned pull-out one-on-one model that's probably going to have limited impact. Increasingly, though, we're seeing speech pathologists working shoulder to shoulder with classroom teachers in early years classrooms, sometimes doing some embedded tier 2 work almost seamlessly and invisibly, such that someone walking into the classroom might not recognise that it's tier 2 work that they're doing sitting down next to a child. So I think we need to be exploring models of best practice so that we're making sure that we're using those resources, because many children who have reading difficulties have underlying language problems. Many children, of course, on school entry still have phonological substitutions and errors that are going to get in the way of early decoding. So there's a lot in play that taps into the expertise of the speech pathologist, but I think we're not quite there yet in working out what the best models are.
Great challenge to our team and our structure here in Sandhurst as well, that I know Lauren Cook, the lead of our speech pathologists, and that team will grab with both hands in terms of that challenge that you've put out there, Pam. You touched on then that tier 1 and tier 2 instruction and intervention and withdrawal of students. Give our listeners a push here in terms of quality tier 1 instruction and the time on that task and perhaps some errors that you've seen in your journey around withdrawal of students.
Well, tier 1, I won't say it's everything, but we need to put a lot of eggs in the tier 1 basket. Again, going back to public health principles, which is where this idea of tiers of instruction comes from, because it's about universal, targeted and specific intervention. And we can apply that model to road safety, to a whole raft of different public health problems. And it comes fairly and squarely. RTI, the response to intervention model, is a public health prevention model. Now, sometimes when teachers first encounter response to intervention, the title is a bit jarring to them. Why are we talking about intervention when we're talking about all kids? And so I always say, take out the word intervention if it works better for you and substitute instruction. So think about it as response to instruction, because mainstream classroom instruction is, if you like, an intervention in children's lives. We're intervening to improve their learning, to give them something that in most cases they weren't going to get in any other way. So tier 1 needs to be where we use all of our best china every day. Every instructional minute matters, and these instructional minutes belong to children. They don't belong to adults. They're not ours to waste. I think that's a big ethical imperative and a big moral challenge to us about how we use children's time that belongs to them. So we need to be making sure that we're being highly purposeful and structured and explicit and also responsive. And as we see teachers become more skilled in explicit teaching, we see that teaching becoming more responsive in the moment to what's happening in the classroom. Initially, of course, there needs to be, and it's quite appropriate, that there's more reliance on scripts. That's completely fine. Kurt Engelman outlined in a podcast interview with Zach Groeschel last year, we give actors scripts and nobody balks at that. You could give me the same script and it would sound terrible, but a professional actor is going to do something very different with a script in the same way that a professional teacher does something very different with a script than what a person coming off the street would do. So we need to invest very heavily in Tier 1 to minimise the need for Tier 2, because as soon as we're pulling students out of the classroom, we're on the horns of a dilemma. What is it in the day that is so unimportant that these students can be missing that curriculum exposure in order to be catching up in something over here that they've already been exposed to, but they're not where they need to be? And I don't think anyone has the answer to that. And then, of course, there's going to be a smaller group again who are going to need individual support at Tier 3, typically probably students who do have a diagnosis, a formal diagnosis of some kind of learning disability or some form of neurodiversity, as much as possible where we can embed the Tier 2 extra opportunities for exposure and practice within Tier 1. I think that's where we're going to see better results and not be dealing with the timetabling and scheduling nightmares that are created when we have that pull-out approach, which is also not always good for kids psychologically.
So many different aspects to that. The first is around that script and that actor analogy. It's so strongly aligned with we have different instructional models that happen in different systems, but the majority in line with that aero gradual release. Our teachers need to start at a point, don't they? And we know the benefit of the experienced, skilled expert that gets to that point, and that's when the script is still there, is a great support, but they can use that. But you can't start with what you don't know. So I think that notion is one thing. The other themes that came through as you were talking then around that ethical and moral imperative around using students' time. There's nothing more heartbreaking than students with low fundamental literacy skills in secondary schools and through upper primary that are in tears because they have to go to their literacy intervention because they miss their PE, their food tech, their science, their whatever it might be. There's nothing more heartbreaking than seeing those kids distaste and dislike for being forced to go to an intervention. And, I think that schools have tried their hardest in that space, but it just re-emphasises that point that if we go hard and we go early and we help these young people in those foundation years, we don't need to have that pain and impact on them and their well-being later on.
Exactly. And this comes back to another analogy that I like to use of building fences at the top of the cliff and not parking ambulances down the bottom, because those ambulances are never happy places to be. We don't have enough of them. They're not well resourced and well staffed. The people in those ambulances are doing the best with what they've got, but the students don't want to be in the literacy ambulance. So we do need to invest in those fences at the top of the cliff and also have a mindset of high expectations of and for the students. So not be corroded by what George W. Bush famously referred to as the soft bigotry of low expectations.
Pam, Ollie Lovell interviewed Doug Lemov recently on his ERRR podcast, and there was a fascinating part right at the start of that podcast where Doug was talking about a university student challenging the lecturer because, what do you mean I'm expected to read books? We don't read books. And the whole notion, there was a brief discussion around that time of people taking to be able to read books. So wave the wand, we get everyone right by grade 3 and they are able to read. What are some ideas or thoughts or suggestions that you can make in terms of helping that culture of reading as a really positive thing? We are partnered with Oka in Magnify Sandhurst, and we're really proud in our knowledge-rich curriculum to have a really strong reading spine. that's part of that work and the study, so we can hand on heart say that students in Sandhurst are reading books and are reading particular books for specific reasons. But are there ideas or suggestions or perhaps things that you've seen across the world that are helping people understand the benefits of reading?
Really good question, Tim. I really like the idea of the reading spine. I think we've been caught fiddling while Rome burns on the impact of screens on children's lives and on our lives. Guilty of tending to read things on my phone, although I prefer to read paper. I most often read things on a screen, either on a computer screen or on my phone. And I think the technology has got way ahead of our knowledge and understanding of the impact. We're starting to see the impact, and we see at the university too. This is something that's coming out in another PhD student's work, Amina McLean's work, looking at university students' literacy skills. But she's particularly at writing, but she's surveyed and interviewed university academics across a range of disciplines, and they're all tearing their hair out saying they can't get students to do the readings. Now, university students have probably never done all of the readings, myself included, that were set, but it is getting harder and harder. I am concerned that schools are increasingly using excerpts of novels, not getting students to read whole novels. I don't think the human brain has changed all that much since I started secondary school, and my peers and I had to read David Copperfield in Year 7. Now, Year 7 students reading Dickens anymore, I doubt it, and I do worry that we're dumbing things down. So we need to be building reading stamina. We need to be working with parents on reducing screen time, screen exposure, and we won't have students reading if they can't read. So we know that, to paraphrase a big longitudinal study that was published a couple of years ago, skill comes before thrill. So we've got to get that competency in place before students are going to read for pleasure, but we won't be building stamina while screens are competing in the way that they are. And we adults need to think about our role modelling to the young people in our lives. What are they seeing when they look at us in the kitchen, in the living room, when we're sitting waiting in the car? They're not seeing adults reading books and magazines. They're seeing adults scrolling on their devices.
Pam, the next big thing is a danger, but also a reality to that in terms of the educational landscape. What do you think we should be across or aware of or paying additional attention to? If you feel like we've maybe, I don't want to say cracked the code, but made the right positive steps with regard to reading, where else should we be focusing?
Well, I think, and I did blog about this recently, my concern is that we're going forward, we're going to be having equally vociferous debates about teaching knowledge and what knowledge. And I do think it is the core business of schools to be teaching knowledge to students and for schools to be equipping teachers with the most efficient ways of providing knowledge, whether that's using resources from OCA or other high-quality platforms. I am concerned about the ongoing commitment to discovery-based, project-based, inquiry-based learning that exists in many Australian schools. So there's not an accountability in place really for what students are learning and who's learning what. I think it's very hit and miss. And the nature of the debate about knowledge-rich curricula in universities really concerns me. When you see education academics talking about the learnification of schools, I think that's a terrible noun for someone to have invented to describe the teaching of knowledge to students and to be disparaging the teaching of knowledge. And some academics argue, well, yeah, look, it's probably fine to teach knowledge, but we need to stop and have a big debate about what knowledge we're going to teach. Well, what do we do in the meantime while we're having that big debate. So I do worry that we might have got ourselves out of the ditch on decoding, because the evidence on that is very strong. We have not only empirical research-based evidence that we've had for a very long time, we've now got a lot of practice-based evidence from the schools that have changed their instructional approach, and we're seeing the uplift in their data. But unless we can agree on and then what happens from year 3 onwards in terms of making education a truly enriching experience from a learning about the world perspective, so that students leave school, if you like, literate across a whole lot of disciplines and domains, so that they can go on to further education, training, and just become literate citizens who are critical consumers of news and can fact check things that are fed to them by the media, by government. You know, I think as a country we have pretty low levels of what might be considered basic general knowledge. And I'd include myself in that. There are several areas of what I would think would be basic general knowledge that I just don't have. And I'll blame my schooling. I could have picked it up along the way. Some of it I have. But I think that's what we owe students for the time that they invest in coming to school.
I don't think you're the only one with a possible absence there, Pam, but you are remarkably well read and across it. I'm sure you've done a staggering job playing that catch up. In that space, that's part of our instructional model, and our focus on knowledge-rich curriculum is the intent that, quite simply and plainly, you have to know stuff in order to be able to explore it further, be part of meaningful conversation or contribution to anything, and coming in with an absence of that is only going to be to your disadvantage. So that's the work that we're trying to do. We're very, very early in that work, but I think that notion that you've got to be able to have an understanding of something in order to be able to explore that further with someone else.
Absolutely. Background knowledge, we know, makes a huge contribution to reading comprehension. I think it might have been Greg Ashman who said, knowledge is like Velcro, it sticks to other knowledge. Why wouldn't we want to live in a society where the average level of background knowledge is high? I would rather live in that kind of society where ideas are debated and contested from an evidence-based perspective rather than from a pseudoscience perspective. And we've seen some very harmful consequences of that, even just in recent times since the COVID-19 pandemic.
Pam, a couple of quick ones to finish. If every school had a billboard out the front, what would it say on it?
It would say something about teaching every student, having high expectations for every student, fostering well-being through achievement and engagement and connection. It often strikes me that when I visit schools, and I do visit a lot of schools, that they often have key words, above the entrance door or near the office or maybe on pillars outside, and they rarely say anything about learning. You see words like connection, collaboration, resilience, respect. Well, all of those things I think should be a given. I would really like to see something on a billboard outside a school about high quality learning, because, I don't think it should be a special point of difference that this school promotes respect. That should just happen anyway. But I want to see schools making a difference in children's learning.
Thanks, Pam. If you were to give advice to schools generally, something to keep, something to cut, or something that they might need to coach a little bit harder, pick any of those three or all of them if you like.
Something to keep is a focus on discussions about learning science, the science of learning, what constitutes evidence in learning science, and being discerning about what isn't actually evidence-based. So keep that mindset of skepticism. Be skeptical, ask questions. I think that's a must-have across all levels of education. Not to the point where we're paralysed and say, well, we're not going to do anything until the jury's completely in and we've got 5 replication studies. That's silly. We can't do that. Sometimes we have to play the probabilities and say, well, based on what we know now, what's the best approach for now? And then we can modify it as we go forward. So keep that skeptical, questioning mindset. What to ditch? Ditch practices that don't align with, in your case, the Magnify approach. There are lots of practices when we look at reading, for example, that absolutely are not consistent with the approaches that align with the science of reading that you're using in the Sandhurst Diocese. So we've got to get rid of 3Qing when we can't have any evidence of 3Qing. We've got to get rid of Skippy the Frog and Lips the Fish and those kind of posters in classrooms that I think absolutely deprofessionalise teachers and teaching, and they are nonsense-based. They don't provide, telling a child to get their mouth ready. You and I don't get our mouths ready, Tim, when we're trying to read an unfamiliar word. We get our brains ready and we're activating our knowledge about how speech and text map to each other. We need to be ditching levelled predictable readers in the early, particularly the very early stage ones. I don't mind if children who can read are picking up texts from levelled reading systems later on and reading them, but I don't want to see beginning readers reciting from predictable texts and looking at pictures. So ditch the unhelpful advice to parents about, good readers look at pictures, use context cues and so forth. So we've got to get rid of all of that. Ditch the banks of sight words that pretend that reading is a visual memory task. There is a place for teaching a small number of words to the point of automaticity in early instruction because they're the mortar in decodable text. And they're often more irregularly spelt. I would also ditch the idea that words are spelt either regularly or irregularly and encourage teachers to be thinking about a continuum of regularity, and some words are much more at the regular end of the continuum and some words are more at the irregular end of the continuum. And when they're also high frequency words, we want to be teaching those. So words like the perpendicular I, we want to teach that early because children are going to see it a lot in those early decodable texts. So ditching the things that don't align with your pedagogical models and perhaps being of a mindset to be looking out for those things because they are understandably so ingrained in teacher practice.
I think that de-implementation plan and planning that goes in that space of ditch, as you put it, is really important. And I know that most systems that are going through change have been really particular about some of that work. There's a great de-implementation report that I'm pretty sure the new Northern Territory government have developed. If people are looking for one, it was an excellent plan that someone last year, as we were setting up Magnify, put us in the direction of that, and we used that extensively as we were doing some work in that space. Pam, I've got 2 to go. Hopefully this is an easy one for you. You've mentioned you've been in schools frequently. A most recent highlight that was just extreme joy for you, what did you see that you loved?
I love going into classrooms and seeing children sitting engaged in rows. I think that the seating arrangement should echo what the learning intention is. So if we're wanting children to collaborate on something, then they should be sitting in a way that they can talk and collaborate. But when we're talking about literacy and numeracy blocks, we're talking about knowledge and skills that involve a lot of cognitive load that are really going to tax children's executive functions. So recent experiences that come to mind are of going into classrooms of children in rows being taught by a teacher at pace, lots and lots of responding. So whether that's choral responses, mini whiteboards, turn and talk, these are not quiet classrooms where the only voice that's heard is the teacher's. High quality, explicit teaching, quite noisy classrooms, if that's a metric of any kind. But, we have heard over the years that teachers say, my principal likes it when he or she walks past and hears a lot of noise because they say, that's an engaged classroom. Well, we all know that we can all be engaged and be learning absolutely nothing. And I can have university students engaged in discussion activities and at the end of an hour they've learnt absolutely nothing. I can think of a few recent examples where I've just seen, it's just an absolute art form really to see how polished those teachers are in using children's time and how purposeful they are. But there's a lot of of responses per minute from the children.
Beautiful. Distinguished Professor Pamela Snow, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure. We, again, just to go right back to the beginning, we value enormously the contribution you've made and your sharing that you've been part of with us and the wisdom that you share. So a special thanks once more. We always finish with what matters most. Of everything that we've discussed today, everything that you consider as fundamental in aspects of your work, what matters most?
It's hard always to pinpoint one thing, but for me, it's seeing an uplift in the professional knowledge, skill and expertise of teachers, and consequently the professionalism of teaching as a profession. If I leave a legacy, it would be that teaching has a much higher esteem in our community because we've ensured that teachers have a specialised body of knowledge and skills that is hard to acquire, because it is, and that isn't possessed by people in other disciplines. And that's one of the reasons that we do hold other professions in high esteem, because we know they've got that specialised body of knowledge and skills, and we hold them to account to be applying that knowledge and skills in ways that produce good outcomes for their end users.
And thanks so much for that thought, and we can't wait to welcome you into some of our classrooms to see some of our magnificent teachers.
I can't wait either.
And we know you're not a stranger because you are local and you will remain in constant and regular contact with us, and we appreciate that enormously. So thanks again for joining us today.
You're so very welcome, Tim. Thank you for the conversation.
That's it for this episode of Magnify Matters. Make sure to follow the show and share it with someone who cares about great teaching and learning. You can also leave a review or connect with us online at Catholic Education Sandhurst. Until next time, stay with us as we magnify what truly matters.